Dearest Houdini enthusiasts, dearest procedural people, come and gather. Are we running? Yes, we are. I might introduce you to Jakub Spacek.
Perfect, perfect.
Thank you. Who's going to present the craftsmanship, or his craftsmanship in VFX, which is quite amazing, I must say. So please, take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you all of you guys for sticking around until the very end. I can imagine it was a long festival. Craftsmanship in VFX, the reason I chose this name is because I would like to touch a little bit on overlapping disciplines that are not only digital. And in this presentation, I'll start with showing you my showreel with a little bit of animation so you know what I'm essentially about. And then I'm going to break down a few projects so you have a bit more understanding of my approach and process and thinking. So let's have a look. And I think we should have a sound, but let's see, we can do without it. Thank you. And before I dive into my processes and Houdini, I would like to take you on a little detour into my past, roughly 10 years ago, where my Houdini brain cells essentially started to form. And 3D, I started originally in Cinema 4D, and 3D was always a tool for me to visualize my ideas, how it is for anyone else, essentially. And as easy as it is to work with certain things in 3D, it's equally painful to make your ideas in a physical world. So during my studies of industrial design, I started to begin this sort of journey of exploring different realms of different materials. And from the very beginning, one of the things that I wanted to squeeze out of the studies was exploring these material realms and approaches, which inevitably led me to meeting a lot of craftsmen and people that work with these different mediums. And one other example was just this brief. By the way, I'm not by any means any professional designer, and I'm just purely passionate about this stuff in terms of where I come from. So one other project was like creating the sustainable, easy to make gardening tools that led me to meeting an amazing guy who works with in these musty, metal-smelling environments where you can create all your ideas. And really, it's about overcoming the challenges when you want to, even a simple idea like this, create in a physical world. And without any sort of manufacturing lines, you end up overcoming a lot of issues. I was also privileged to spend time for a certain amount in ceramics manufacturing facilities, where I had the ability to research how you work with this medium, how you cast, how you create the molds, and work with these individual processes. It also led to my passion project, which was one of the most influential ones. Now, probably most of my friends have one of these cups, whether they like it or don't. So it was really important for me. And I started by reaching out to different manufacturers in glass, and after a lot of failures, I came across this manufacturer in North Bohemia, DT Glass, and it was very personal because the glass master essentially took me into his like a workshop, showed me all around, even taught me how to mix the gases to get the right temperature and all this stuff. And I really started enjoying watching him work. And during this video that I was shooting, and to understand the process and do a little documentation, I realized that he will be sitting there creating, let's say, 1,000 of these glasses, one after another. And there was this absolute absence of any sort of anger or disappointment where things go wrong. So it's about the patience and discipline with working with heavy things. With now, I can perceive that simulations in Houdini are. So this is just one image that I want to highlight. After you have all this glass done, you can look at it through this special filter that sort of reveals the heat temperatures after baking it in the oven. So it reminds me a little bit of the velocity fields in Houdini that are so well known. And at the end, I started creating other designs. And one of the common things that all the craftsmen have is they don't care about your visualization. They don't want to probably see much of detailed blueprints, but all they want is some sort of dirty, rough sketch with some quotes. So now I'm going to talk about a project which inherently carries a lot of these elements. And while I was working in the ceramics factory, I had this idea of creating, let's say, what is happening within the mold when we're creating these ceramics processes. So Ceraflow is a project that was living for a few years now online, and I would like to break it down a little bit. So here's a little animation, what it's essentially about. So just to mention, the sound was created by super talented artist Eric Schilke. He just reached out to me to work on some project, and we ended up doing collaboration on the Ceraflow. So check him out, he would be super happy to collaborate with you. And as I was carrying this project in my head for a long time, at the beginning I didn't have the expertise in Houdini, and I didn't know how to achieve something like this. But eventually I ended up with skills that would enable me to create something similar. And I had this idea of an abstract visualization, what is happening within all these mixed processes of different materials. And originally I wanted to do something around bases and sort of interior decorative shapes, but I was interested to art direct the liquid simulations in a way that they would end up in a perfect shape. And usually with liquid simulation there's a lot of randomness and chaos that we can't really art direct. So the main challenge was to develop a system that would enable me to achieve all these results. So everything in Houdini, when it comes to simulations, is usually driven by velocity fields, and that's not always, but mostly the case when you want to art direct anything like points, liquids, even fluids like smoke, and etc. So after several weeks, I ended up with a result that was satisfactory enough for me to start working with in more in depth. So usually you start with some low resolution simulations, and eventually you want to create a high resolution that carries enough data that you can transfer into the surface. So here I have a roughly 20 million point simulation that carries all information like age, color, UV coordinates, and etc. And when I turn it into the surface, I can translate all these informations on the mesh that is being created. So one of the important steps in this process was the ability to work with textures that can give us options to get more detail and interesting animations on the surface. This specific texture was provided by Roman De Giuli, that you may have known from his amazing real-life footage collages So check him out if you don't know him. It's one of the examples of a real-world craft that can inspire digital art. So after a certain amount of time, I ended up with a really good result. And here is a little example of each attribute that gives us values for the points that are in the simulation the most amount of time. So I'm just using it to blend different materials, and I really started to enjoy the process of finding the look and developing different shaders. I knew from the very beginning that I want this setup to enable me to mix multiple layers of liquid simulation with different properties, and the process of finding the right setups for them to interact in the right way was excruciating, and at times it reminded me of those Craftsman moments that I observed when I was in all those different manufacturing environments. So eventually I ended up with something that was good enough for me to start thinking about how two layers of different liquids could interact. Originally, I was considering that they maybe wouldn't mix and they would be kept separate in their original forms. One important thing during all these processes is monitoring and sort of remembering how you achieve things that are like errors or issues or something that you didn't intend it initially. So this was one of the sort of messed up examples that I actually enjoy quite a lot. In the next stage, I was able to mix those, let's say, different layers so they would interact in the right way, but they wouldn't mix, and I would end up with something like this. And then I ended up with something that was working in all those different layers that I wanted to mix. Speaking of textures, utilizing a lot of different textures, I was able to add that additional extra detail that would give it all the properties that I wanted for individual materials. Everything was rendered in Redshift, and the shader building in Redshift is super smooth, but it allows you to create infinite material combinations by utilizing, mathematical principles, layering colors, and blending different shaders. So inevitably, after that, I chose to create this material selection, and the first one was ceramics that you already know, and it was really about porcelain, ink, gold, jewels, and sort of prestige. Another one was more about earthy, soily, decorative, and celebratory moments. And lastly, acrylics, which was about acrylic paints, oil paints, working with canvas and really getting the tactile feeling of how it works. After that, I was tasked to create a little NFT collection where I squeezed in 10 more materials out of the setups, and it really enabled me to explore all the possibilities working not only with the liquid variations, but the material variations as well in more of a procedural nature. So this being the digital idea that I carried, roughly 2 years ago, I was approached by a dear friend of mine who asked me if he could take on one of the acts and do it as a technological research for his diploma in ceramics and porcelain. So I'm just going to take you throughout this little recipe how to prepare this delicious egg. So everything starts with creating 3D model. So we chose one frame of the simulation that would carry most interesting moments. as a starting base for all the designs. And this is roughly day of retouching and correcting, because 3D printing isn't perfect in all cases. And after a day, you end up with something like this. In the next stage, it was important to create the mold for the ceramics. So this is around 2 days of work. This little bastard weighs 40 kilograms, and it dries for about 1 week. Here you can see Josef with his proud egg mold. And in the next stage, you take roughly 20 liters of ceramics liquid, you pour it in. After 1 hour, you have this solidified shell that gives you the base for the final sort of thickening. And it takes 10 to 12 hours to get the final result. After this, you can either choose to utilize the whole egg that comes out of the mold, or in our case, we wanted to create different moments of the simulation, so it would be handcrafted into these individual eggs. 1 egg would take around like 8 hours to polish and finish for the next stages. Then it takes roughly 2 days to dry everything out, and all these little processes, in an annoying way, you can't make faster, so you have to just wait out what it needs. There's a lot of corrections happening, and finally it goes into the oven for 900 degrees, where it takes roughly 14 hours with cooling as well. Here are some honorable failures, and during this process we realized that traditional ceramics is not going to cut it. So we had to transition to heat-resistant clay that allows us to bake in higher temperatures and also utilize pigments and materials that otherwise wouldn't be normally usable. Afterwards, you do glazing that you can either be spray painted or dipped into a planche, and then you proceed with coloring the final egg. I started this project during Easter, so it would be actually a good idea to do Easter eggs as well. Here we have the initial collection, which was trial and error, but we were sort of happy with where it get to. And in the next stage, we started testing different approaches, how to put the pigment onto the egg so we could get more of these flowing elements that we've seen in the simulation in 3D. Eventually, the last approach that we are working on now with combines mixing those pigments into the ceramics while it's being poured into the clay, which is closer to what I'm actually doing in the 3D simulations. And because it's a heavy mold, you need 2 people to operate it. So one is sort of angling it so you can start mixing with those pigments. And this brown is actually the blue pigment that will end up being blue when you bake it. The problem is that you can't tell what shape you are putting in, so it's a little bit of a rough estimation. Here's a little result after it dries. Then you get a result after it gets baked. Then you put a glaze on. And at this moment, we ended up with a collection of these pretty little 6 eggs, where a few days ago there was an exhibition in Czech Republic where we were proud enough to present them to a few interesting people from the Czech scene in ceramics. So we will continue this process, start implementing gold as well to match as much as possible to the original animation. Just need to mention Josef is super talented, so reach him on Instagram, give him some love, and who knows, maybe you can collaborate with him one day. So another project I want to talk about is for a company called Alchemia. It's a medical research company, and I was approached by them through agency Kyoto. It was a medical research project, and it was purely about abstraction, some scenes and environments that they could use for their website, social media, or whatever. So I had a lot of free hand, and as nice the client was, he was mostly absent. So there was a lot of blind shooting in the process. I started with doing some of the sketches. I would like to start with just doing something outside of the computer every time I start working on simulations or something in Houdini. And now I'm just going to take you through how to make this stuff in Houdini as simple as possible. So I started with a torus. In Houdini, usually you start with some primitives, or if you work with points or sub-simulations, you can start in a different way. So here's a basic torus. Then we apply a mountain sop. Every time I say sop, it refers to surface operators. Probably everyone knows that. So I gave it some basic shape. And then from a simplified version of this torus, I just select some lines, edges, extruded them to get these weirdly looking sheets. And then by using Boolean, I can direct these sort of circle fracture pieces. Then by using fracture sop, we get more individual pieces, and utilizing the remesh, I ended up with this organic structure that I originally envisioned in my sketches. Now you can see there are some small pieces intersection that are not really pleasing. So with the measure sop, you can measure the volumes, which is the essential size of individual pieces in your scene, and get rid of the ones that you don't like. So the main idea here was to utilize vellum simulation so I could constrain all these pieces, and while the animation is happening, I would be able to keep everything in the composition without breaking it apart. So I started doing also some material explorations and basic lighting setups. Everything had to be rendered in 5K, so everything had to stand up in those close-ups. I also knew that it would be nice to have some additional details, so I just used scatter to get some points around to feel how it feels from a distance and in close-ups. In next stage, because all these pieces have their ID and names, usually it's like a class or a piece, I can select individual pieces and give them some sort of different shapings or operations. So here I use the twist and bend node to create these tentacles that would grab onto the incoming molecule. The whole idea for this animation was like 5 to 10 seconds where incoming molecule would sit into this protein. And really this is not scientific, so molecules and proteins, I'm just using it as a reference as it was presented by the agency. So this was the initial animation, and then I just started playing around with more materials. The idea was that the materials would be different per each element. I also tried to extract some of the old geometry, created it into collision, and just played around how it would feel in this vellum simulation. Eventually tested different materials, and I was also tasked to explore some more modular approach to how these pieces could function. So I was looking at some shapes that could maybe represent something viral or organic, or like a bacteria, or some playful shapes for the incoming molecule. I also wanted to squeeze in this material that I really had fun to developing. It's very simple, and eventually I managed to do that as well. The idea from the feedback from the client was that they wanted to simplify everything and had less shapes in the scene. So I sort of reiterated the whole process that I already had from the previous setup. And I started with fractured pieces, give it some clusters so you can bind different fractured pieces into larger wholes. And utilizing remesh, you again ended up with this sort of organic looking shape. Now, PDG being procedural tool, I was utilizing, Houdini being procedural tool, I was utilizing PDG, which is a procedural dependency graph. I'm going to talk about it later a little bit. But essentially, I was doing loads of these wedges, if you heard before from Paul, and you can select multiple different variations, and then from then you select just one that you like the most. So it's a very easy way to iterate throughout the looks of your composition. So here I ended up with something that already had the composition that I was looking for. This sort of molecule in the center needed to be embedded. So by using explode tool, I just offsetted the position and gave it a started position. And here's a little simple animation that came out of it. So because I mentioned the pieces and names, you can easily take some pieces out, do some operations on them, bring them back into the composition and run it through the vellum again to then have the simulation still holding up. And this was one of my favorite ones. Vellum is a super clever tool, as Paul mentioned before. And then here, at this moment where the molecule sits into the nest, I can use different types of constraints to sort of glue it together so it stays there, it doesn't get distracted. Now, Also utilizing PDG, I could quickly switch around those individual pieces to reapply the setups that I had in them individually across the whole scene. And really started to messing around with the materials and the simulations across all those pieces. So here's a little example of all the iteration, or like some of the iterations that were going around. After some selections from the client, we had this initial composition that was sort of holistically finished, but we knew that we needed to push it somewhere better. So one other element that was looked at was this incoming molecule, and I always wanted to put it this lava lamp-like feeling. So during this exploration, I knew, because it has to hold up in close-ups, I was steering away from utilizing textures, and all the shaders and detail were coming from procedural noises. Eventually, we steered away from the lava lamp feeling and went into something that's more like atomic or protein-based structure. And now I'm just going to run you through all the iterations, or some of them. Finally, we ended up with the composition that the client could choose from all the elements that I was providing them. So they would essentially go through the individual models and say, we want the top to have this look, the bottom will have the liquid simulation, and sort of build it their own little Lego composition. And because it was rendered in 4K, they could just jump cut and zoom in into details or moments that they like and utilize it in any way they essentially desire. And because I mentioned PDG, the next project I want to talk about is a personal project where I had to heavily rely on the capabilities of PDG. So now it's almost 2 years ago when I was approached by a group of individuals, and they wanted to collaborate on a 10,000 NFT collection. Now, this project is still ongoing, and usually, 10,000 collection NFTs are still images. So one of the tasks that I've been presented with was creating animations. And when you have a 10,000 animations, you need to think about how you're going to process them. So that's where PDG will come in play. Also, another part of this project was data visualization. So the idea was that they will provide me with data from a blockchain and I will visualize them. So I started looking into some ideas that I had from the past. I was thinking about points. I heavily worked with points, grain, and simulations like this. I had a lot of setups with velocities and how to drive and art direct behaviors. I looked at one reference that I worked on in past, and I really enjoyed the idea of simple block that would contain all these data. Eventually, I ended up exploring the roots of lines instead of points, and noise being sort of orderly chaos in mathematically represented in Houdini. It gives you a lot of options how to have variety for your iterations. So I started looking into how to bound these noise fields or volume trails in Houdini into these blocks. And why blocks? Because blockchain is obviously right onto the blockchain in blocks. And each block has huge variety of data. So I needed to have sort of visual language that would enable me enough variations within the individual blocks so I can utilize as much data from the blockchain. Here's a little example. I was thinking about that across the data set as I would be progressing, the visual language would become more complex, more digital, and more intense. I was exploring combinations between more organic and more digital-looking noises, and also how to multiply different type of noises to get the intricacy and look that is desirable. Because the data set is enormous across 10,000, and the reason why it's 10,000 is because last year we hit 10,000 bitcoins on the blockchain. So there was this idea creating evolution of historical ages that would represent some sort of new outlook on how human civilizations was developing. So I had to come up with a way how to streamline these linear noises into different visual languages. Now, knowing that there's multiple blocks per day being created, we also needed to separate the time of how the block is represented. I'm going to show you a few examples how different visual languages started to form across different ages. One of the medieval ones, which I had no clue how to represent, but eventually I looked into these interesting patterns that were coming across in a great way. There was also some idea about different materials. This one is about exploration and adventure and some sort of nature element. Or also how to visualize something from industrial revolutions or industrial and oil that modernizes our technologies. One of the principles that I was also exploring was density in space within this block and having enough iterations to represent it. We also needed to have an environment that could carry all kinds of different data, or at least the practical readable data for a potential collector. So one of the things that we wanted to implement would be also automatically generated QR codes. So this one specifically leads to some random library, but it's a good example of what would be in the final product. Eventually, I ended up designing the environment so the distance would be readable enough also for the QR code, but also for the data that will be embedded in those systems. Now, all this data will be coming from the handed over data sets. Here's a little example, and now let's have a look at the data. So the data would be handed over in an Excel spreadsheet, and I know there are ways how to work with data coming from Excel in Houdini. I think Moritz here did some of the tutorials himself. I thoroughly researched them, but knowing that everything has to be streamlined without having to step in manually for each of the blocks, I needed something that would be readable by PDG. So after a while, I mean, it was a long while, but I managed to find a way how to work with Excel spreadsheets in PDG. So what we see here on the left side is the example of fraction of the data that's coming into the Houdini. And on the right, there's for each of the columns that I would create this sort of streamline that initializes that there will be incoming spreadsheet. Then it takes which column and row we want to work with. Then it selects specific amounts of the data. And at the bottom, it copies all this data from Excel onto empty wedges that are coming from the attribute creator. So next part of the PDG that I needed to cover was the rendering side of things. So when you render animation, you usually have a sequence. And if I would be to manually go through every sequence, re-export it and apply all the post effects on it manually, it would take 70 days without break. So it's not something that would be doable manually. You can see I have different render nodes, so for every age there would be different properties, and I always had different dawn and dusk depending on which attribute from the spreadsheet is coming in. So that would be different time of the day for different blocks. I also had many different takes, so it could vary lightings, materials, and setups. And what you see on the right is that all the data that's coming from the Excel is partitioned and separated by the index that is dawn and dusk in a spreadsheet. If I'll go back, here you can see on the left, there's dawn, dusk, dawn, dusk. So all this data is separated and will be rendered by different render nodes. And you can not only select which render node will be utilized, but apply all the post-production in Houdini in PDG. So then, after the sequence is rendered, I can apply ACES color space, I can do redshift post effects, and finally have an MP4 generator. So at the very end, I click Houdini to do this generation, and then I end up with 10,000 MP4s. In this case, it was just a test on 100 animations that would be made out of 5 frames in a low resolution. But the technicality of this was solved, and I could move to proceeding with the sort of design. Here's a little example of scrubbing through the data incoming from the dataset. There would be different data utilized for different age. And because data is often very similar, so across those 10,000 blocks, a lot of the data would be very similar looking based on the values that will be incoming. So we needed this differentiation. And each block on a blockchain carries his special hash number, which is a long, extremely long string of letters, numbers, and we could utilize this. It wasn't me, I wasn't consolidating all this data, but it was handed over to me by a colleague and generated into RGB values from this hash number. And this RGB would then be inputted into the setup or the shader in Redshift. Another example where I utilized all those tasks from PDG was generating different patterns in COPs in Houdini. So each of these blocks will have intricate details that will be always different from the previous block. And lastly, with the data, one of the things that had to be done is how to take some of the practical data that's readable and understandable and input it into the composition on the pedestal. So here I was using font node in Houdini and procedurally extracting data from PDG into the text layout in the font. So across all those blocks, there would be differentiation between what we see on the pedestal. So here's a little example of some of the ages, and obviously all being procedural, even the shaders. So in the close-ups and details, the level of detail still holds up. Here's another example of some of the ages. Here we have a medieval one, and again, the patterns on each of these blocks will be different every time new block is generated. Renaissance, the main issue here was to have enough fidelity in the marble texture that would work across different sizes of the lines in the block. So I ended up creating a custom marble shader in Redshift that utilizes some of the data to vary, offset, and give it different properties. Now here, this is one of my favorites. It's a discovery age, and here we have this essence of a sort of adventure, jungle, treasure hunt, tribe, and you can see that in the detail there's a lot of variety for each individual block. It's an industrial age. Then we have an informational age, and here I really enjoyed because sometimes you have a cable, within the cable is small cables, then there's like copper cables, etc., etc. So it was really fun to creating this rich system that would give you so many different variations across each block, as it would also get more sophisticated as the data set is progressing. Jet age, this is where I was exploring angular designs of aircrafts and ships, and eventually end up with something that gave me a lot of sort of detail, but recognizability with the tech that it's related to sort of aircrafts and these type of vehicles. Space age, this is sort of upgrade because we're going from air to space, so there's a lot more digitality, solar panels, and more technology involved. And then final one is a blockchain age, Web/Web3 age, which is most vivid, contrasty, and playful, and carries most variations across all the ages. So if you are interested just for your sake, have a look at studiobxp.com. You can give us some feedback. And I would be personally interested, this is the first time I was showing this project anywhere, so I would be personally interested to just understand, is my thinking, is my methodology coming across the right way? What do you think of the ages? Is understandable that the data is transforming and changing? So if you want, give us a shout out. And I'm going to finish up with the project Neil. That was an experimental project I did with a dear colleague of mine, James Lee. Unfortunately, he can't be here today. So Project Neil was commissioned by a French cheese company. It's a really strange project. And we were tasked to create four different realms that would loosely represent different processes that are happening in macrobiology of making cheese. So we obviously knew nothing about this, but the client didn't want something that's scientifically represented. So we literally could have done anything we wanted. And one thing I need to mention, the whole project is done on single machine on 20 Ti. It's rendered in 4K, it's 60 seconds per animation, and we had 3 weeks to do everything, including the R&D. We worked with simulations before, including me. I never worked with simulations in Unreal, so it was a little bit of a risk to do, but I felt it would be interesting to push our skill in this technology and creative way. We started with blocking out some basic color theme and also how the layout of those animations could be done. So we had some 2 landscapes and 2 portraits. And we really started with bouncing ideas, exchanging setups in Houdini, and all the R&D that you'll see that's coming from Unreal already. So Unreal at the time was coming with version 5.1, I think, and until this day, unfortunately, you can't utilize displacement maps on animated geometries. However, you can utilize nanite, so you can bring in really high fidelity mesh and details into Unreal. We did a lot of exploration across all the different simulation techniques. Here's some examples of Vellum and RBD. We were literally just messing around, doing some inflatables. There were 4 worlds. One was airy, one was crumbly, liquidy, and soft. And we were just trying to find some language that would be readable from Unreal as well. And Unreal utilizing nanite, once you import your simulations that can be really heavy, and maybe it can take 15 to 20 minutes, but once you have it there, it's very easy to instance, copy, and have large scales if you need to. Eventually, we ended up with this sort of cave design, and one of the things that we needed to have covered is simulating only the areas that the camera will be perceiving. So in most of the cases, we would slice through the environments, simulate on what we see, and then bring it back into the rest of the environment. And also, all of these simulation had to have some form of looping. And like Paul was mentioning, looping is not super easy when it comes to simulation. So we eventually find it a hack or some sort of cheat around it, that we would move camera or regrow some of the patterns that were happening. I think here it's going to happen at this moment, and we would just start from the initial position. In another one, we were exploring rigid bodies, now bringing a lot of simulations with Alembic, which is fine, but one of the things that we discovered or found out during this process was working with FBX, specifically FBX when it comes to rigid bodies. Now, once you create your fractured pieces and fractured material in Houdini and have everything set up, you can do all kinds of different animation that then you can translate into Unreal only as a point information. So you're not bringing the geometry every time you have a new simulation. You have the same fractured pieces, but the animation of those pieces would be changing. So it's super fast to iterate all kinds of different motions and movements that you want. One of the simulations that we explored as well were liquids, and that was pretty straightforward, bringing like alembics with textures and UVs if we needed to. Here's some of the explorations. It was sort of fun seeing how simulations behave in Unreal, and it really opened our thinking about how we can approach some potential tasks that would otherwise be complicated or heavy. And in the liquid one was really about trying this blending different materials. So in Houdini you can use attributes in many different ways, and you see them as they are on the points. But to bring them into Unreal, at this point, what we were using and what we are aware of is storing it in a color. What's advantageous? Color is a 3-vector attribute, so you can have 3 different information stored in one color attribute. So it was really useful to creating this blending material. And the last one was a soft realm where we just experimented with a lot of vellum and bringing it into Houdini as another example. One of the issues with the soft one was you can notice there's this kind of edge happening on the simulation when you merge it back into the environment. And that was really about finding a way how to make the simulation look seamless, even when you create some post-production, smoothing, and operations on the surface afterwards. Here's another example. It was really about using colliders and different vellum settings to have the right motion that we wanted. Here's a sort of pre-final example, and you can still notice the seam at the bottom, but eventually we got it to a stage where it was unrecognizable. And it all comes down to a way how to constrain the edges that are separate in a seamless way. Now, here's a little example how it looks when you bring everything in Unreal. And for someone who works with simulations, I love simulations, and I would like to think I'm relatively patient when it comes to like waiting for something to load in. When you bring it to Unreal, you scrub through simulations regardless of their heaviness in real time. So the work with the simulations in Unreal was really like a little bit game-changing comparing to how we work normally. And you can do lighting and material exploration really quickly and get the results that you want. And then the rendering side for the final obviously take a little bit longer than the viewport, but it's not like Redshift and you don't need potentially farm. We had very limited budget, and that was also one of the reasons why we choose to go through Unreal A. So this is sort of like a summary of this project. And if you would be interested to know more about Houdini and Unreal, James and I will be speaking at FMX purely about Houdini and Unreal, and we will be working on a project specifically created for that, and then we're going to break it down and sort of teach what we learned on our things. So thank you so much, and yeah, any questions?
Thanks so much. Impressive work. What struck me is how photoreal and how influenced by your background as industrial design your work is. So that amazed me a lot.
Appreciate it.
Open mic. So if anyone's got questions, let me know.
Don't worry, I know it's late.
Okay, so you said that you can scrub on the timeline of the simulations. Can you tell us why? I mean, is it like loaded? Is the Alembic is as the whole simulation, and when it's loaded, it's like in the RAM, or?
So I think this is where Nanite does its magic.
So it's basically a viewport thing, you say? Because if you have, for example, in each single frame, for example, is 2 gigabytes, and then you are scrolling. Can Unreal basically load and unload this, or is it loaded at once?
We haven't tried it on like 100 gigabytes of simulation, but even, for example, the liquid, comparing it to Houdini, where you would have to literally wait for it to load in,
exactly.
even as points, there it was just scrubbing through. I can imagine that if it would be like, you know, hundreds of gigabytes of sim, there would be some delay. But Nanite, I really don't know how it works, but it's quite magical what it does in terms of like workflow. So that's pretty cool.
Okay. So.
Anyone else? Yeah.
As long as you import the Alembic to Unreal, the nanite is working out of the box.
Could you repeat the question, please? So
yes, so the question is importing the Alembic into the Unreal and the nanite if it's working out of the box, right? So you can import Alembic not into a nanite, but if you choose to import it into a nanite, it will take longer, but then you have this sort of fast feedback options. So it's really good.
All right, so I'd say we close with that. Thanks so much for the amazing talk. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for attending. A bunch of Houdini guys rambling on about their work. If you haven't tried it, try it out. It's frustrating, but it's worth it.
It is worth it, yeah.
And yeah, have fun for the last day at OFF. Good to meet you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.